Hello SGD, Sacred Geometry Decoded, and I'm just going to do a setup video because I want to look at some interesting things in regards to columns. Now I'm beginning with Egyptian columns, and why I'm looking at columns is because that's basically by looking at the column and the decoration you get an idea exactly where and when you are in time. So if we begin with Egyptian columns. So for instance we focus on this, and this we have Hathor head capital, and again across Egypt from quite early period to up to the very last days of Egypt, with places Philae for instance. There you can see the Hathor head capital. I'll put a couple links in the description because the sistrum is connected to these Hathor columns, but you'll see them elsewhere. And for instance Hathor columns, and often the sistrum, I'll link those in there. Abu Simbel for instance, you can see again the Hathor column and this shaft, and then above it we actually have a sistrum in there. So this is connected with Hathor, this musical instrument. Dendera is the same, and probably the picture's not best resolution, but again we see sistrums above that there, even holding the sistrum, and again the column itself points towards that musical instrument. But so here we see some Egyptian columns, but the main grouping. So we have the lotus bud, the lotus flower, the papyrus blossom, and the palm leaf column. So focus in on the papyrus, and so that's a papyrus plant. It's of course where they make papyrus, the paper material that they used to write on, and we see like the papyrus bud. There's an opening bud, and the actual open papyrus. Now it's an important feature. So another one of the main forms, traditional forms of Egyptian columns and decoration, is the papyrus. And now if we look at the lotus bud and lotus flowers, and if we focus in on this section, so you see the lotus flower and the lotus bud, and also these piers at Karnak which have the lotus and the papyrus. The lotus flower, very, very important from many aspects, but has an actual photo from Karnak where you see the lotus blossom and the papyrus there. Now that's an important feature for many reasons, and here's lotus flower columns. Now they tend to be more less intricately carved, but the lotus and the papyrus are linked in a very important way. There's some lotus buds, and that's another form of Egyptian column design. But the reason why papyrus and lotus are so important was because Lower Egypt was symbolized by the papyrus, the delta, as where Upper Egypt, up the river, the symbol for Upper Egypt was the lotus. And so that's one of the reasons why lotus and papyrus are so commonly used and put together in so many decorative forms. But you see those, you know you're in Egypt. But the other form of capital is the palm leaf capital, as we see there. Palms are very important, especially in regards to Chesed and Thoth. They both carry the palm frond. Palm frond was used as a counting instrument, also related to the measurement of time in regards to the sistrum. Okay, but palm frond, especially to Thoth and Chesed, very important symbols and connections. Now, Thoth is linked to the ibis, and the ibis's nest in palm trees. But so we see a palm leaf capital, and you even see the palm nuts in there as well. And there's another, so we see the papyrus, but also the palm leaf. I think this is at Edfu, or anyway, but again the palm leaf, it's just one of the traditional designs. Now, because capitals tell you where you are, so there's some illustrations of the main forms, the lotus, the papyrus, and the palm. Now another ancient culture was the Minoans, and for instance in the Temple of Knossos on Crete, you know, once you're familiar with the columns, you know exactly what you're looking at. This is a Minoan style, and it's one of the giveaways is that it's very narrow at the base and it expands outwards towards the top. It's the reverse pretty much of every other column style, which tend to be narrow at the top and broad at the base. So that's Minoan. Now, one of the reasons is Minoans were a seafaring culture on Crete, for instance, and they built ships. Now, if you look at Crete now, it's been deforested. So much of the Greek Isles have been deforested. In the past, they had cedar, and that was one of the main materials that they would build their ships at. Phoenicians, for instance, same thing. They were a seafaring people. You need to build ships. You need timber to do it. And for instance, the red cedars of Lebanon is one of the last surviving forest of cedar trees in that part of the world. You really have to go into the mountains of Turkey and these more remote regions on the edge of the Mediterranean there to find cedar being grown and being able to harvest. So that's one of the reasons. The Greek islands, Greece, a lot more cedar forests. They were shipping, they were using timber to make things, and that's led to the deforestation. But this is a cedar trunk. Now, the general consensus in regards to these Minoan columns and why they're narrow at the bottom and thick at the top is that they're based on the tree trunk, and the tree trunk was turned upside down to prevent sprouting. However, this is Seahenge in England. It's part of a cluster so Seahenge is one of these wooden circles that actually are in a larger circle surrounding a central point, but Seahenge has 55 oak posts around the outside, 21 feet wide, but an upturned tree that's been buried there. Now that's I'll get to that in the next parts, but this concept of the upturned tree is a very interesting one, and would lead to, okay, but that's for the next part. So another one of the cultures, you see these are Persian or the Assyrian influence, Mesopotamian. So for instance, we see the Lamassu, which is a sort of giveaway of where we are. Now, is that it? Yeah. The winged lion with a man's head, but also this column style with the twin bulls on top. So the decorations, again, the decorative style, especially on columns, is unique to different cultures and to different eras, and it's a giveaway of when and where you are, and this would be an example of a Persian style of architecture. So we see a close up there, like the Lamassu and the twin-headed bull, but also these, again, column styles give you an idea of where you are. This is the Parthenon. The Parthenon is actually, anyway, but what we have is Doric columns. So that's the original Greek order of architecture is Doric. And you'll see that, for instance, in the Temple of Corinth, the Temple of Apollo at Corinth. Amongst other places, they have single-piece columns. Column drums such as these came later, because what you have is actually in between each of these layers, you have a timber plug. It's much better at surviving earthquakes. You might have heard, and I've remarkably heard people say that the Greeks and Romans didn't build with single piece columns. This is entirely false. They did. The reason they moved to these columns is because they survive better. They don't fall apart in earthquakes or fall over as single piece columns do. So Greeks, Romans definitely built with single piece columns. The granite columns at the Pantheon in Rome are single piece columns imported from Egypt. That's all there are multiple examples of it. So if you've heard that the Romans or Greeks didn't build with single piece columns, utterly untrue. It's better to build with multiple piece columns because they actually survive better. It's not a good idea to build single piece columns. An earthquake comes, your temple falls over. It's actually a bad idea. But Greek columns, the Doric order, for instance, in Vitruvius, who reports on early Greek writers, now the Doric order represents the column of man, or the column of strength, and still in esoteric traditions now it's related to the sense of seeing. But generally believed that the Doric order emerged from the simple design is based on a tree trunk. There's good evidence for this. For instance, the temple, Temple of Zeus in Olympia, so where the Olympics were held, they were preserving the timber columns and slowly replacing them with stone, because the older stone survives, but when it comes to these ancient ruins, we don't see the timber work or the mud brick that was used in there. For instance, at Karnak, the priest would go to the top of a roof and make the astronomical observations from the roof. There's no surviving stone staircase because the timber and the mud brick has rotten away, been washed away by parts. You'll often see square holes in ancient structures where timber beams would be inserted into. For instance, the Colosseum, they put big timber beams. Anyway, the timber work doesn't survive, and it's easy to imagine that there wasn't timber work in these type of structures, but the origins of these emerge with timber, and the concept generally agreed, and great evidence for it, that the tree trunks were very important. For instance, old Greek temples had a oak tree in the center of the, temples built around a sacred tree. But that's one of the concepts of the Doric order, emerged from timber constructions before they moved to stone, because again, deforestation, the old cedar forest, you had to import timber from further and further away. Now, above in the Doric order, you'll see these structures on top. These are called triglyphs. I've seen these reported as impossible ancient technology. Remarkable for someone to suggest that. It really is, an apprentice mason should be able to carve these things quite easily. Now, what we have is the triglyphs, but we also have these things called the gutae. There are different ideas. Okay, firstly, timber construction being the inspiration for the Doric order, and these being the joints of the original. So the stone building pays homage to the original timber structure design. So these bars just really represent the joints of the timber structures that would have supported the roof, and these features sometimes described as being representative of water droplets. However, as other would suggest, because back in the day they didn't have, they had iron and bronze and brass nails, but they didn't tend to work with those features. For instance, back in the day, you would use a timber wedge and you would split tree trunks. You didn't cut them with a saw. But these represent basically dowels or pegs that would be hammered in underneath to bring as something like a nail, a wedge, where you hammer it in and it strengthens, puts the building together. This is they would use these like dowels and this type of thing in shipping, ancient ships as well. But that's one of the concepts that where this design and comes from, paying homage to the timber. So before stone, they were building with timber and wattle and daub, and that would be an early concept drawing of previous huts, and how this design of the more elaborate wood construction influenced the timber construction. So that's the Ionic order. The second of the Greek orders is the Ionic column, where we see these swirls here. This is the Erechtheion in the Acropolis, right next to the Parthenon. But we see again sort of the Ionic order of architecture. As where the Doric represented the male, the Ionic represents the woman, also known as the column of wisdom, and is related to feeling or the sense of touch. Now, one of the, according to Vitruvius and these early writers, these simple swirls of the Ionic represent the simple hairstyle of a mature woman, not a virgin or a maiden, but a woman. So that's the Ionic order. But also the third of the Greek orders is Corinthian. This is a temple of Olympian Zeus, just underneath the Acropolis and the Pantheon. There we can see the the Corinthian capitals. The Corinthian is called the column of beauty, connected to the maiden or the virgin, and it's related to the sense of smell. There are 3 Greek orders, then there are 5 Roman orders. So the Romans added 2, the Tuscan and the Composite. That would make out your 5 senses, but I won't go into the Roman orders for now. And the Corinthian capital is based on the acanthus leaf. So just like the lotus, the papyrus, and the palm leaf, there is a plant connected to this Corinthian capital, and that's the acanthus plant. So the Corinthian capital based on the acanthus leaf, and now we have the 3 Greek orders of architecture: the Doric, the Ionic, and the Corinthian. The male, the female, and the Virgin, which is also the column of strength, the column of wisdom, and the column of beauty. Now, for instance, in Masonic tracing boards, you'll see the same. So you have the Doric order, the Ionic order, with the swirls, and then the Corinthian order. And this one gives it a bit more better. So again, the Doric order, the swirls of the Ionic, and the acanthus leaf design of the Corinthian. Very important esoteric symbolism still now. Now, the Kailasa temple in Ellora, India, one of these 108 feet by 100, well, the measurements in there are just, again, beautiful connections. But again, you can just by the style of the decoration, you see where you are. And for instance, the column styles tell you where and when these are built. Now, just like with the Doric and Ionic and Egyptian columns, they've been repeated again throughout. But when it comes to these temple designs, the decoration and the columns especially really are indications of that particular culture and the particular era that they emerge from, because there are evolutions even, for instance, the Doric and the Ionic and the Corinthian. There are subtle but small variations, and once you're used to seeing them, you can place them to a certain period. For instance, the Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian are the Greek orders, but the Romans also use them. They have 5 orders of architecture: Tuscan, Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, and the Corinthian composite. But there are small, subtle variations, and you can place them to a period, but also in some cases to certain temples because of the variations on these particular styles. But overall, now this is carried throughout time. Now, for instance, here we see a collection of various columns, including Egyptian, and there's a Corinthian, Greek order. Well, it's a special one. We'll come to that in the next episodes, because there's a lovely connections which also link cultures and how cultures influence one another back and forward. But up here we have what's called the Byzantine basket, so the Byzantine form of architecture, and these are Byzantine columns. Now, Byzantine is the Western Roman Empire. When people think of a Roman Empire, they think of Rome. The Eastern Roman Empire is the Byzantine, centered in Constantinople. The Western Roman Empire collapsed about 400 AD, but the Byzantine Empire, or the Roman Empire, actually continued through right up till around about 1200. But the styles of architecture kept on evolving. We can still see, for instance, the swirls of the Ionic are still visible, and you can see subtle connections also to the Corinthian order of Greek architecture. These styles evolved, but they evolved and changed enough to be clearly to show you the location and the time period. Now, this is Hagia Sophia, and so you can see these columns here, and it's an Ionic column, which has been varied ever so slightly, but it retains the Corinthian order of the acanthus leaf in there. These are another variations of Byzantine architecture, which you can, even in the early Islamic period and the mosques there, for instance, in the Dome of Rock in Jerusalem, you can see these earlier periods, how they were early on almost directly copied, and then evolved and made subtle changes as time went on. But the evolution of architecture and the influences, they're different enough to place them to a certain time and to a certain location, but they also have enough commonality to show that this has been evolved and passed on and moved throughout time. So they're independent, yet they're also joined together. So right up until the Romanesque period, or the Gothic style architecture, this is Durham Cathedral. And where are we? So we have this traditional water leaf from the Galilee, and this is in Durham Cathedral in England. And there we see the water leaf design. So there is showing a connection, an evolution of time in various forms of architecture. In the next one, I want to look at a few specifics and show how the Indians influenced the Greeks, and the Greeks then influenced the Indians. The Greeks were influenced by the Egyptians, and then that led to various forms and evolutions in architecture linking, for instance, this particular style, very unique style of Corinthian, which has the acanthus leaf plus the Egyptian palm frond, as we see there as well. But I'll do that in the next one. Also in regards to the Minoans and the upturned tree and some of the symbols and connections in regards to that one. So that's just do an introduction and just to familiarize if you've not looked into these forms of architecture and how they get very different yet very much connected. Even in the measurements and proportions of temples is another thing as well. But also how through Rosicrucians, Freemasons, etc., colonial architecture, even for instance the US Capitol building, US Supreme Court building, the White House have these Doric, Ionic and Corinthian columns, but also the architectural designs and decorations connected with them. So it's not just the columns, you'll even, once you get used to seeing them, for instance the president will often have meetings with foreign leaders and they'll be sitting in front of a fireplace. You'll see Ionic columns decorating the fireplace, and of course Corinthian and Ionic architecture, so there's Ionic as well. So these forms, styles will tell you where you are, but there are interesting again, for instance the evolution of the Doric. So wood doesn't survive. There are very few ancient Chinese structures, but ancient China is very, very old, but the architecture hasn't survived from ancient China because they were timber rich and bamboo rich. They had plenty of material to build from, and so you still see Japanese temples, etc. They use timber. But in places Greece, Egypt, Mesopotamia, where they were started out timber poor or eventually become timber poor because of deforestation, because they were building so many ships, their architecture evolved from wood into stone, and even still bears some of these traces in there as well. For instance, even the Egyptian palm columns. Why did they, not just because stone lasts, but also it was, well, we're running out of materials, and we've deforested, the world has been deforested, we're making so many ships, we're building so many houses, etc. It's also necessary to move to stone. For instance, most of on the east coast of South America, where the Amazon is, plenty of wood to survive. There's not much stone building, but more towards the west coast of South America, Peru, etc., where they're on the dry side of the Andes, there's very little timber, and so again, the natural reasons to make them want to build with stone, as where places where there's lots of timber or bamboo or these other materials, well, you would make it from there, and they just don't survive the test of time. These structures, which would have a lot of timber connected to them, whether it's for staircases, etc., those have rotten away. Only the stone remains. Again, different architectural styles, and I'll do that all in the next piece. But yeah, just wanted to intro some of the basic styles of architecture, especially related to columns, and then in the next few parts have a look at the more interesting connections and also the fusions between various styles, connecting various cultures, and also some of the more subtle hints and interesting symbols in regards to those. So whether it's from ancient Egypt through Mesopotamia, Greece, Rome, ancient India, stonework, column designs, the symbolism connected with them but on various forms, and especially the concept of the certain plants being used as a basis of the designs and the forms, and what that also means, what that leads to. So SGD, hope you enjoyed. Again, this is just an intro for the new to these forms of ancient architecture. There's very actually little about this type of stuff on YouTube, but at least as a whole, there's a lot of small videos that will go into very specific details on various column designs, but it just hasn't really been unless you look into specific, very elaborate, long texts and read into it, it's just again, it's not something that's not being covered very often. Mystery sells, but details not so much. Anyway, cheers and have a good one. More to come on this.